Welcome to Sunday Morning Conversation, everybody. Today, my guest is Umesh Venkatesan. He is a TBI scientist, and we're going to talk TBIs today. I wanted to talk some brain injuries. I know I haven't done it for a little bit, so thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Oh, it's another day in the life, at least it's the afternoon.
That's true. Yeah. Almost evening.
Yeah, I'm glad I could finally catch up with you.
Yeah, me as well. I'm glad you connected with me on Twitter, and I'm glad we could make this happen, even if a little delayed.
Yeah, so what were you doing in the meantime? I'm not putting you on the spot or anything, and there was a lot of academia related.
Yeah. So we in academia, we always go through these cycles of writing papers, writing grants, writing papers. And so sometimes it's like a heavy grant time, grant submissions come up. And so that's some of the stuff that I was working on and planning summer projects and submitting things and things like that.
Okay. So what have you been working on lately, like research wise?
So research wise, a lot of different things. So all of my research pertains to traumatic brain injury. That's what we focused on, moderate to severe brain injuries. And I am trained as a clinical psychologist. That's my background, even though I don't practice psychology. So most of our studies pertain to, psychosocial outcomes, cognitive outcomes after traumatic brain injury. We do some acute, like inpatient studies, but most of my work focuses on people who have been out of their injury for a long time, at least a year, several years, and also studying older individuals. Some of my most recent work is looking at memory, particularly in after brain injury, and also some of the social factors that that contribute to outcome after injury, and how like mental health interacts with that too. It's sort of a lot of different things pertaining to psychosocial rehabilitation. So whatever goes into that, we study, and most of our methods are behavioral studies.
I'm actually that's why I tried to link up with you. I'm a TBI survivor. Mine was about 4.5 years ago.
Yeah. Yep. I think I was aware of that. I wasn't sure exactly how long ago, but yep, that's good to know.
Yeah, so I mean, at this point, I'm used to what I have being permanent. I was told that by my neurologist. After 2 years, basically, what you got is what happened. Is what you're gonna live with. Which actually, due to my living situation, I didn't have a good support system. I was with someone, and they didn't really want to be a part of my recovery. I actually made some progress after that 2-year mark.
Yeah. It used to be, people thought that like what you said, like you live with whatever you have after a year or two. And like, it's true that most of your recovery from your injury happens, early on like that in the first year or two, but it's possible definitely to have gains afterwards as well. That's why rehab is so important, to like keep working on it.
So what is some of your favorite research that you've been a part of?
Favorite research that I've been a part of. So yeah, my trajectory has been kind of interesting. So, when I was in graduate school, which actually wasn't that long ago, I'm early career. I'm like a younger scientist, but when I was in graduate school, I was doing a lot of neuroimaging work, so MRI studies on traumatic brain injury. And now most of my work is sort of more rehabilitation, sort of clinically application focused. And I think I really enjoyed that aspect, the sort of the applied work. Some of the stuff that, I've really enjoyed is the stuff that I'm getting into more recently, in terms of social factors, and how that affects people, how, experiences of discrimination affect people, how different social groups might experience, brain injury outcomes differently. So we're just starting to get into that work, learning a lot about it. But that's where I find like most of my excitement going. It's a big field, it's a big thing, and it's important to do it responsibly. So learning about that's been really exciting.
So when I had my MRI DTI, I did it at this place up in Sandy Springs, Georgia. And they said, yeah, what kind of music do you want to listen to while you're in there? I'm like, I don't care. I said, hip hop, right? So they're playing it. And the thing is, they're playing it through Spotify, but they didn't bother to pay like the $3 a month or whatever. They have the free version. So every time like the machine stops making noise, it was a
Yeah.
commercial.
Yeah.
It was horrible. I left it on their
That's not
Google. I
good.
put it on their Google review. But yeah, that's my MRI
That
DTI story.
yeah, I'm sorry about that. That's really annoying. I mean, it's annoying if you're not in an MRI, but that's definitely annoying if you are in one. Yeah.
Yeah, man. So I'm blanking on what I was going to ask you next. That happens to me a lot. Yeah. So with your with your new role, being more part of the academia and research side,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
what has been some of your most interesting findings so far?
Yeah, that's a big question. Because so I'm starting, just to give you context, I'm starting up my lab. I joined my current position in 2019, and I've been building up a brain injury lab there and sort of solidifying research programs. And so some of the things that we have been working on, like I said, pertain to memory and how to measure memory. And a lot of the things that I've been getting into more recently, like I mentioned, social factors, but also tied into that, what people believe about their functioning, what people believe about their rehabilitation and their potential, and how they're doing, just on a day-to-day basis, and how that plays into the outcomes that we measure. So a lot of rehabilitation has been focused on, these outcomes that are defined by providers, right? Healthcare providers. We want to see you improve on this test. We want to see you improve, even if it's a questionnaire, we define the cutoffs and we're looking for certain symptoms or something like a symptom reduction. But only recently, I feel, we've had more focus on, well, what does the person, the patient, the client, whatever you want to call them, what does the person actually think? What are their health beliefs? How are those beliefs informed by, I don't know, the culture that they come from, the social group that they're in? What do they feel about disabled people in general, right? What do they feel about their own disability? And how that influences all of their daily outcomes and the things that we measure. It's not really captured in our measurements because we're looking at sort of objective things, frequency of things, amount of symptoms. We don't really capture their perspectives necessarily. And that's a really important, the patient's voice essentially is what I'm talking about. And so how does that play into their outcomes? So we had a paper recently that looked at, what people thought about their memory, and how that impacted their quality of life, in addition to how they actually perform on memory tests. But what do they actually think about their memory? How well do they think that their memory, or how good do they think their memory is? And how does that impact? Does that uniquely impact their quality of life? Or is it just how they perform on the test? Their objective ability is what that determines. And what we found is that there's a small effect, but what people think about how they're doing really does matter for these other outcomes like quality of life and how much they participate in activities in life. It does matter, and we may be missing that in rehab and in rehab research and even clinical work. So building up that more is kind of where I want my direction, research program to go, and all of the factors that go into our sort of schema of how we think we're doing, if that makes sense.
It does. And I mean, to let you know, but there is definitely a stigma attached to brain injuries.
Of
And
course.
most of us are very well aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, empathy is something that is hard to come by for brain injuries because it is an invisible injury. People, if you can't see it, you can't relate. That guy walking down the street with a cane, in that wicked limp, right? People could feel empathy for that, but it's harder for other people to feel that towards a brain injury. And
Absolutely.
I find that outside of healthcare professionals and people who have had a personal experience, either having one, being a caregiver or a friend, something like that, they just don't understand it. And the lower your education level it is, the further away from empathy you're going to get from people. And that kind of causes other people like me to kind of be more reserved because it's not well accepted.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And that's some of the things that we're studying. So we have a study right now that's looking at how early life experiences, adversities that people experience, how that contributes to their outcomes later after a brain injury, because these things affect the entire life course, whether or not you have a brain injury or not, right? But they may be especially consequential for someone who is struggling with the consequences of a neurological disorder. So we're studying that. Along with that, we're studying about perception, their own perceptions of disability, and also stigma from other people. And there's many different dimensions to stigma, actual active discrimination, by implicit biases. There's a lot of different like subtle things that you can tap into. And I think it's important to capture all those things like you're saying, because a lot of people just don't understand, especially with things like a brain injury that's not always visible. Sometimes you can tell, sometimes you can, and that's the thing of a brain injury. No two brain injuries are the same. So it really depends, and each person's experience is going to be very individual.
Yeah, and when I've sat down and talked to people who also have brain injuries, I've learned there's a lot of commonalities that we go through, but they are all different. It's just quite a unique experience. And for the most part, I found like the hardest thing for me is I'm now single. I was with someone during my brain injury. They didn't want any part of it. But the hardest part of having a brain injury is trying to date again and get someone to accept of that and whatever your situation is. Because now I'm on disability, right? That's a really hard discussion to have with someone when you're starting to try to date someone again. So there's a lot of, that rises to a lot of other issues like anxiety, fear, self-consciousness, and it's a very difficult thing to a topic to broach with someone, especially early on. But you have to have that conversation at some point. And if they can, most of the time they can't figure out at face value that I have a brain injury unless they start paying attention. That wait, why does it keep forgetting everything? Other than that, you wouldn't be able to tell because I look and sound basically normal.
Right.
But it's still a very hard conversation to have. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people, at least the ones that I've talked to, have that same experience.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of common factors, common variables, experiences that people go through. And it's great that, you have been able to connect with people on those things. I think it's really important that peer support is a very big thing in brain injury, right? Support groups, we have them here too. They seem to really help people, but that's, of course, like you said, it's not enough because people's individual experiences are different too. So it's a challenging problem.
What's something you want to find out? What's a question you don't have the answer to?
The question we don't have the answer to. So there's this idea of brain injury now. It's not an idea. It's pretty much accepted now. Brain injury, way back used to be thought of, or at least it was treated in practice as sort of this static kind of thing. It happened to people, right? And then you had these deficits or whatever you want to call them. You had these problems, and you kind of lived with them, and they were static. They just sort of stayed like that. But people recognized that it was sort of lifelong, but they didn't really consider it a chronic disability. It's something that affects you for the rest of your life, and it's going to interact, and this is the important part, it's going to interact with other things that happen to you during your life. Aging, right? People are surviving brain injuries now, and they're getting older. Aging, with even without a brain injury, brings its own problems, right? There's age-related disorders. There's all sorts of things, cardiovascular stuff that people, aging people go through, and that's going to affect people with brain injury as well, ultimately. And it may have more of an impact just because you're vulnerable. Your body, your system is vulnerable, and so how does that interact with brain injury, right? So as someone ages, as someone experiences, especially oftentimes, unfortunately, we see people injured quite young, young males especially injured, and they live life with this chronic disability. It isn't static. It interacts with all the other experiences that you're going to go through as you sort of mature and age. And how are you disproportionately vulnerable to some of those problems as you get older. We have some, we've been looking at that for a while. We're trying to see, people have been asking, is there an inflection point where things get worse, at a certain age, or if you've been living with the brain injury for a certain number of years, what's that point where things go downward, right? Or do they go downward for everyone? We're finding out that it's a very complicated answer, because just as no two brain injuries are the same, no two post-brain injury trajectories are the same either, right? So even if you have very similar brain injuries, two people injured at the same time, similar short-term outcomes, they may look very different in 20, 30 years. So what are those factors that leads to someone having, have a more rapidly declining trajectory versus someone who's able to, maintain their functioning better? So these are all the questions that, and what are the factors that go into that? They're both biological, they're social, you mentioned social support, they're psychological, all of these things that we have to take into account. So that's kind of the stuff we know that we recognize we're calling it a chronic disorder now, where we weren't before, a chronic disability. Now, what contributes to the chronicity? How can we mitigate some of the potential negative effects of that chronicity?
Yeah, seeing that my grandfather is 87 years old, and I just spent like the last week back at my parents', so I saw him a lot. But I wonder how, with his dementia, how that will affect me with the brain injury later on, how you would combine those two things. And I know it's really an unknown question. It's more like we just have to wait and see.
Yeah. We know that, they say that there is a risk for, cognitive decline and stuff with brain injury, but many people who have dementia now didn't have a brain injury, right? So it's not like an absolute, or it's not totally determined that if you have a brain injury, you're going to end up with that. There's a lot of people with brain injury who never developed dementia. So what puts you at greater risk? Is it genetics? Is it biology? Is it social factors? The answer is probably all of them together. And so we have to better understand that equation, so we can find out where we can actually intervene. And like you said, there's open questions surrounding all of those things right now. We're learning more and more, but there are definitely open questions.
What are some of the things that you found that are truly unique to brain injury people that haven't shown up in any other research that you've done?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I give you a little bit of context. So I've done mostly brain injury research my entire career. I did a little bit of aging and dementia at some point, but my publication list, most of it is in traumatic brain injury. And the reason that I got into it initially was that I was a research assistant at an organization in New Jersey, where I'm from, right after college. And as part of these research, we would do research testing, neuropsychological testing at these day programs, where people with TBI would go and spend the day. And at the time, I was early 20s. And I was testing these people who were my age or younger than me, right? These were people who had folks who had very, very severe injuries. Some of them could not talk well. They weren't very mobile. They had very severe injuries, a lot of them. And I just loved working with this population, because they had, despite their problems, their significant problems, they had, a personality still. There was a person in there. You could see the person of who they were before, and they were injured at a time in their life where so much is happening, right? Where you're maturing, your late teens, early 20s, you're finding out who you are, you're getting into life, you may be going to college, all of these things, right? And then something just throws your life for a loop, and they're just trying to get it together. They're just trying to, because they know they have to live with this for a very long time. And I definitely connected with them because I was, of the same age, of the same generation, right? So we definitely connected, but our trajectories were completely different just because of this unfortunate event. So, and a lot of and some of these folks, this is not true for everyone, but some of these folks had certain adversities and problems before their injury as well, which made the I'm going to call it population. I don't want it to sound very clinical, but it made this group of people very interesting because they had these life histories that you can see that they were bringing to the table, bringing to their rehabilitation that were going to affect them later as well. They weren't always the most affluent people. They weren't always, have the most educational advantages or anything like that. So there was just a lot of uniqueness about the population, who they were before the injury, at the time of the injury, the time the injury happened, and then what it means for the rest of their life. Who hopefully it's a long life that they have left to live, but it's going to have a lot of things in it that they have to deal with. So there's just these multiple factors that made these group of individuals really interesting to me. And I think I was able to connect with that because I was of that same age as that generation. And I could see and sort of see myself in them in some ways too. So if that makes if that makes sense at all, but
no, it makes plenty of sense. And the thing is, it doesn't just happen to people of that age. It happened to me when I was 32. I have been out of grad school like 6-7 years, had my master's of architecture. I was still developing into a pretty good architect.
Yeah.
And then, me, like every other brain injury survivor, you can't go back to who you used to be. And it's like, well, now I have to figure out who I am going forward. Because you have who you used to be, then you have this transition period to where it's different for everybody. Nobody knows how long it lasts till you figure out what you're going to be in the future. I'd like to think I'm towards the end of that transition period, but I still don't know what I'm going to do the rest of my life. I'm hoping I'm on disability because I'm only 37 now. That's a long time to be on disability. I want to find some kind of purpose, but I have sorted a lot of shit out in my head. So
yeah. I mean, definitely, I appreciate of course, I don't have personal experience, but just from seeing patients and stuff and having the close experience, therapeutic experience, and assessment experience with them, I can definitely appreciate that journey. And you're right, it doesn't happen. That was my particular example of how I got into the field, sort of experience with that demographic, but it happens all throughout. It does happen in the younger demographic, 20s and 30s, and then in older folks as well. And that's another set of issues, right? Where older folks are retiring, they're in another part, another distinct part of their life. Everyone is in a distinct part of their life. I think what makes it interesting is this, like what you mentioned, this who you were before, who you were after, figuring it all out, that transition. There's so much that goes into that. There's so much there that we need to study, we need to understand that and more importantly, where we can intervene, right? Where we can, actually make a difference with interventions, I think, if we know where to intervene. And those points of intervention are going to be different for everyone, depending on where they were injured and what they were doing at the time and who they were before.
Yeah. So, hey, Umesh, let me get you out on here on this last question. What is advice that you would give to a TBI survivor that no one else has given them yet?
Ooh. That no one else has given them. I don't know if no one else has given them that.
Yeah, obviously you can't know what somebody else has told me so far.
Right. Yeah, so I'm definitely not giving you any medical advice or anything like that. But I think, that's a really good question. I think doing everything that you can to, and this is going to sound really generic, but honestly, the best things you can do for yourself are the things that we tell just anyone about their health, is to take care of your health, mind, body, and soul. So, which includes not just, taking your medication and eating right and exercising and stuff, but I think it's especially important for people with brain injury being socially active, being involved in meaningful activities, not just activities for the heck of it, but things that are really meaningful to you. Finding a support system, whether that's not family for everyone. So finding a support system that works for you, taking time for yourself, enriching yourself. We call it, psychological enrichment or cognitive enrichment, being really mentally active as well. But this is good advice for just people who are aging as well and want to preserve their cognitive functioning. I think it's even more important when you've had this sort of experience to make sure that you're really taking yourself health-wise, which includes all parts of your health, not just your physical health. Because I think that is going to be, it's stronger. It's stronger than any drug or anything like that we have. So that behavioral change, keep maintaining that positive behavior, health behaviors is going to be more effective than anything that we have medically.
Yeah, my support system is actually comprised of, other than, a family is not a huge portion of that. I have my mom and my dad and my grandfather, but other than that, there's mostly friends. My pet sitter's a really close person. My lawyers, my old lawyers were, part of that, but yeah, it's definitely not all family.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. People find support systems in all sorts of things. People learn how to support themselves through coping and things like that. So it is what works for you.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I got into doing this, because, well, for one thing, as a brain injury survivor, you're always going to have more questions than you are answers. It's probably like a 10-to-1 ratio, right? Each new answer you get will also provide you with 10 more new questions that you don't know. This helps me get some of those answers, but it also helps me understand aspects that are unrelated to it too.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to, related to that point, I want to commend you for asking the questions and educating yourself on it and continuing to educate yourself on it. I am a big proponent of education, and clinically what we call it is psychoeducation, which just means that educating people about their psychological health and their cognitive health and their mental health. I think it's so important. I think we try as providers, and I'm saying this as a trained clinician, we try to do that and provide that education as much as possible, but that education also needs to be personalized to the person. We need to find out what people know, where the gaps are, what they need to know, what they want to know, and consistently feed them that. I mean, we have continuing education in medical professions, right? We call them CMEs and things like that. We need continuing education for patients as well. So I really applaud you for giving yourself that. I think it's so important, and that's also part of taking care of your health. So
well,
that's
thank
great.
you. I mean, people do watch my stuff for some reason, so people like me end up learning more too.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing a service to, it's the best kind of thing, right? It's the best kind of activity because it's a service to the community, to other people, and to ultimately to yourself.
Yeah, and that's something else I learned, that a lot of brain injury people that I've talked to, they end up doing something for activism or awareness, some other way to help people like us. Almost all of them do that.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I mean, it's sort of someone told me this once, an activist, not a brain injury activist, it was like a social justice activist, but I heard it in a talk. People are going to sort of activist in their own way, so find your own front line, which I thought was like the greatest quote ever. So if your front line is making videos and interviewing people, that's great. If your front line is going to Capitol Hill and lobbying and like talking to congressmen, that's great. Whatever it is, you're doing something for the community. Find your own front. Some people do art and sell art and paint the experience. I've seen so many things, and nothing is less than or greater than. It's all everyone's individual front line and how they activist. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I've never heard that one before, so that's definitely a good thing to hear.
Yep.
Well, hey, thanks for giving me your time. I appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah, anytime.
Enjoy your evening.
Yeah, you as well. Take care, Eric.